Why don't you just start talking about what you do when you're practicing for a tournament
Yeah.
and what types of things you were looking for?
Yeah. Practice for an event for me, it's been a process really, Glenn, that's developed, I mean, since I fished at the club level, and but it's always had from day one, it's always had a lot of the same basic elements. And for me, it's kind of broken into two parts, and I've been a big believer of this in my career. And so the two parts of practicing for an event are, the first part is actually the stuff you can work at before you ever get to a place. It's what I call the at-home research stage. And then the second part to my practice period is actually when you get on the water, and you've got that official practice period. And a lot of times that's 2 days, sometimes it's three. So depending on what event you fish. Um, but they're both real important parts, So I'll kind of just give you the breakdown of what that really means, and we could actually use we'll use some real live examples, from the past of what I'm talking about. Um, we could actually take the Red River tournament in Shreveport that we had a few years ago, the one that Skeet won, where I came in second. We'll use that as an example because that was a good one. So basically before I ever got to the Red River for the official practice period, which was a 3 day practice period, I tried to do things at home, months and months before the event to prepare myself for the event or to practice essentially, and there's kind of three things that I do at home to get ready for an event. And the first one is what I call historical research. And all I'm saying when I say historical research is that I kind of look for information that's out there about that particular location. So Red River is a great example. So I knew I was going to the Red, so I started a historical research process. And for me, what that was looking at a lot of old tournament reports. It was researching articles through old magazines. It was gone on the website, Google searching Red River and the pools we were going to fish, looking at the bass fishing websites like BassResource, for information. And so it's getting all these sources, and then what I'm doing is I'm looking for what I call buzzwords, and so I'm grabbing off the desk here. I'll get and I'll just start a notebook, just a regular notebook. I'll buy a whole bunch of these in the beginning of the season, and I'll start this whole notebook. And right at the top, I'll write Red River down on there, and then I start writing down these buzzwords. So, things like lure color. If black and blue jig keeps coming up in all these sources, or an area called Red River South as being a good area keeps coming up, or an area called the Jungle and Pool 4. And so, these are buzzwords that keep coming up. I'll write them down, and so I'm beginning to think about this place. The second part, what I do at the at-home research stage, is I buy maps, and I think in today's age, a lot of anglers, a lot of folks have gotten away from traditional paper maps, but not me. And so I'll go out and solicit map sources of this place. So for the Red River, I think I found like three different map sources. There was like ADC mapping. I think there was a fishing hotspots map, and then there was an actual river chart that was a government chart that was several pages that was basically aerial photos. So I had all three of those. In addition, I went on sites like Bing Maps and Google Maps and was able to actually look at almost kind of these real time photos of the layout of the river. So I've got historical information. I've got my maps now and aerial photos. And then the last part of that is I start thinking about seasonal pattern. And so based on seasonal pattern, I'm able to take these maps and this information of this historical information, and I'm able to take a place that's as big as the Red River, and we had access to three pools there, probably hundreds and hundreds of miles of fishable water, and I'm able to break it down into manageable sections. And those things I do before I ever get there. So for the classic, our event is late February. Based on seasonal pattern, I knew that time of the year in Shreveport and northeast Louisiana, that it would be a pre-spawn, late winter pre-spawn pattern. The fish would be wanting to spawn, staging, moving from their winter places to their spawning areas. And so that coupled with historical research, I could take a big giant place like the Red River and make it manageable. So that's the first part that I do. Second part is when you actually get there, and for the Classic, we had 3 official practice days the week before the event, followed by one more practice day right before the event, which we fished together. You've got some great video clips of that. And I use those days to essentially take this information that I already kind of came up with, this plan I already concocted, and then define it even more. And there's something I really want to stress here is that I'm using that stuff that I did at home not as, set in stone information, but more as a template or as a starting point, something to put me in the ballpark to what I'm going to do when I actually get there and practice. So the first day of official practice, I get there, I'm finally on the water, now I've got a starting point and I've got an idea of what I want to do based on that research I did at home. And so now I kick into the on the water part, which is essentially taking now these smaller, narrowly focused areas that I've figured out at home, and now it's getting out there and kind of using this technique I developed to really hone in on what I call the sweet spots, and what they are is kind of these tournament winning areas. And so kind of give an example of this is again a real life example of how I almost won that tournament. So it was the second day of practice. I was down in a pool 4, down in an area that through historical research I knew was a tournament winning area, and then through seasonal pattern, I was able to look at the map and kind of guesstimate where these fish were going to go and spawn. And so what I do is I get out there and I kind of use this what I call is a fast idle or a zigzagging idle. And essentially what that is I'll get out there and I'll idle in my boat. And as I'm doing that in this area, I'm looking for change. And I'm looking for change 2 ways. I'm looking for change first, the obvious way, and that's with my eyes. So as I'm idling, and in this particular case, it was near a spawning flat. It was a spawning flat, and it was a northwest protected pocket. It's just perfect, and I'm idling. As I'm idling, I'm looking with my eyes, and I'm looking for change. So, in a normal situation, that might be water clarity change. It might be a stick up. It might be a dark spot. It might be, there's so many different things that could be visual change. And then in addition to my eyes, I'm looking at my electronics, which I call my underwater eyes, but I'm looking for the same thing. I'm looking for change. And I remember it like it was yesterday. I was idling across this flat, kind of zigzagging, heading back to where these fish would eventually spawn. And I looked at my depth finder and I kind of did a double take because I thought I was like, wait a minute, did that just happen? And I saw the depth finder was at a static 1 foot, foot and a half, 1 feet 3 inches, a foot and a half, a foot, just really shallow. And all of a sudden I saw it go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 feet. And I'm like, and then I did that double take and then it came back up and it was like 7, 5, 3, 2, 1. And then I was 1, 1.5, 1. And I'm like, oh my God. And I turned back around in that fast idle, went back over that area, and there it went again. And again, what I found now, that time was with my electronic eyes, my Lowrance unit, was I found a submerged hole or a pit. What I ended up finding out later on is that what that actually was an old tank pond that was there before the place was even impounded, was even flooded. But that essentially, ended up being kind of, a winning area. And so once I found that area, the next thing I did was I grabbed a buoy. Next time I idled over it, as soon as I saw that start to drop, I threw a marker buoy out there. Now it gave me a reference point. And now this is kind of the last piece of this this process that I do, and it's what I call using search baits to now not only find the fish or get bites, but define the spot or feel around in the spot a little better. And I've got three that I use that are my favorite. One is a Carolina rig, one is a jig, specifically a heavier jig, and the third one is a crankbait. And in that, and again, using a real life example, in that situation, I took at the time I had a half-ounce black and blue jig, man stone jig, and I had a shallow running black and blue crankbait, bait made by Laser Lure at the time, and I used those baits to search around that hole. And what I did in the process is I got a couple bites, so the fish were telling me they were there. But in addition to doing that, I was feeling the bottom and I was identifying sweet spots within that spot. So not only was this a hole, kind of a ditch on this big flat, but through my baits, through the crankbait and through that jig, I was able to feel the actual composition of the bottom and feel cover and identify sweet spots. And I mean that's kind of a Cinderella story of how this process works. It doesn't always work that smooth, but that is the exact process that I use in every event. It's basically the process I used back when I was a club fisherman in a John boat, and it's the same process I use now. And gosh, it's such a great technique. And I can tell you that I tell people all the time to utilize this. I get a lot of emails back saying, oh my gosh, I went from showing up at a tournament and being confused, feeling overwhelmed, that feeling of dread when you launch the boat and you look out and you're like, where do I start? By using this technique, it makes you a lot more confident. You're narrowing the window, so it's essentially making that fishery smaller, and you're putting yourself in the ballpark, and it makes you a lot more confident once you launch your boat. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but that's the process that I use when I'm practicing for a tournament.
But once you find, let's say you found that one spot you found. If you
Yep.
found three or four of those spots,
Yep.
how do you prioritize which ones I'm going to hit on day
Yep.
one, and what are the ones I'm going to put in my back pocket and hold till maybe the last day?
It's a great question. And, I can tell you that the number one thing that I've learned over the years is that I always go into an event trying to have multiple patterns and multiple areas. So you're right. You find this spot. I caught three or four. A couple of them were in the size caliber that I liked, and I got out of there. I kind of marked it. I mentally now know what I'm looking for. This could be another pattern. Let me go look for other areas. But in addition, I want to find other patterns. Again, getting back to a real life example, that last practice day, which is day I fished with you, we never even ran down to that pool. We stayed in pool 5 and we essentially looked for backup fish. And that's something that I think is important too. So in every event, I try to find an A pattern, an A plan. And in that classic, that was my A spot. And I try to find a B spot, and a B spot, like you said, might be another area like that near that spot, So I did end up finding a few of those. And then I try to find a C plan. I try to find something that's different in a different area, an emergency area. If A fails and B fails, what can I do to go try to catch a couple fish? And so it's important to not just die on that one spot. I think way too many anglers find, what they call glory hole, like that spot, and they just say, that's it, I'm going to win a tournament there. They stop practicing, they sleep in the next practice day, and now that's all they've got. That's the wrong thing to do. The right thing to do is use that as a momentum builder. Use that. Now you've got an idea of what the primary pattern is. Go find a few more of those areas, but then don't even give up there. Then go work further and try to find something else. Try to find a B plan. Try to find a C plan. And I can't tell you in how many events where I thought I was, my A plan was going to win the event, and it ended up being a B or even a C plan that helped me either win or get to a high finish.
Yeah,
Yep.
that makes a lot of sense. You hear a lot of people here. You hear the term that a lot of people win practice,
Yep.
but then they don't win tournaments, and it's
Yep.
because they do that. They find
Yeah.
that one spot and they bank on it. Another thought process is also they catch a lot of the fish, that they would have
Yeah.
otherwise caught during the tournament. So, what are your
Yep.
thoughts? Do you clip off the hook points? Do you bend the barbs back, or do you catch a few fish to see what's there? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
It's a great question. And, I think all tournament anglers are faced with that at one time or another, no matter what kind of event they're fishing. And, for me, it's a strategy that's based on when the practice period is. So, I can tell you that let's take a regular Elite Series event, for example. The first day of is usually a Monday. The start of the tournament's a Thursday. On Monday and Tuesday, which are, 2 or 3 days before the event starts, I want to see a couple. For me, it's not enough, especially let's say in a fisher like the Red River. You go back to that example. The water was muddy. I'd have no real way of knowing the true caliber of those fish unless I saw a few. So I'm a big believer in seeing a few, in catching a few to see the caliber of fish, but not trying to win on practice day, like you said. That's a great point. But I do want to catch a couple. My general rule of thumb is like two or three. I like to catch two or three fish to see the caliber of fish. Once I do that, I don't need to catch any more there. If I'm going to continue to fish around that area, I will clip off the hook, or I'll, tie on a bait where I can't hook them. I'll do those things. But let me tell you this, that the closer you get to the event, the less I even like to see them at all. So getting back to an example of when we fished together, going back to Hartwell Lake, the day before the tournament, again, we fished, me and you fished together, and, I didn't want to see a single fish. I was dialed onto the pattern. I had some really juicy areas, and all I was doing the day I fished with you was kind of trying to expand my territory. And I didn't want to hook a single fish. And so you remember we cut the hooks off those jigs and we kind of led a lot of those fish around. And I think that helped. I went back to a lot of those areas and caught fish in those same places. So, I guess the best answer to that is definitely do not try to win practice. Try to get a feeling for what lives there, establish some confidence, and then leave it alone.
Okay,
Leave it
and
alone.
that's perfect. And then the last question is, during that tournament, now you've got everything staked out. You've done your research. You've got your A, B, and C, maybe even D planned. You go
Yep.
out on day one, and none of those work. Now
And
what?
that happens. And
Right.
that does
It
happen.
does happen. What now? What do you
Yeah.
do?
Yeah, well, I can tell you that there are days where it seems like, all your cards are faltering. Nothing's working. And usually it's an A and a B. And usually, I'd say 9 times out of 10, that C or D, you can go catch some fish. And I'm not saying, these are the winning caliber fish. Um, but I'll give you, I kind of call it two of my fail-safe plans when nothing else works. And then I'll follow that up by giving you one big theory. So the two fail safes for me, one is marinas. Marinas are launch areas. Over the 13 years of tournament fishing professionally, I can tell you that when everything else has failed on me, I can always go to a marina or a place where I know they have tournament releases out of, a release site, a launch site, and I could catch a couple. It's a surefire way, and like I said, again, it's maybe not winning the tournament, but maybe it's catching a couple, or maybe it's catching a limit, or whatever it is. That's one surefire way to go catch a few, is to fish around marinas and launch sites. And then the second one for me is bridges and riprap, or what I call causeways. It's another one of those areas that no matter where you're at in the world, in the country, no matter what time of the year, a bridge piling, a riprap causeway, a roadway, they're the kind of places that always hold some fish, and I could always go to those places and catch a couple. So they're kind of two fail-safe areas for me. And then my theory, and I believe this, is when everything else is faltering, I'm a big believer in grabbing what I call my panic box. And all panic box is essentially, it's a glorified finesse kit that I've created. So when A fails and B fails and C fails, I'll head to a marina, a boat ramp, a bridge piling, or a roadway. I'll pull out a spinning rod with 6 or 8 pound tests and a panic box that's got things like little worms and grubs, ultralight crankbaits, inline spinners. almost trout and crappie baits. And with that panic box and with that finesse rod in those areas, man, I tell you, in those 13 years, I don't want to say I've never been skunked because I have, but it's really been a great way to salvage a tournament.